Hello everyone, and welcome to War in Middle-earth, a series where I take you through all of the major wars and conflicts throughout the history of Middle-earth, from the First Age to the Fourth Age. In this episode, we look at the wars the dwarves fought against the dragons and the orcs. Previously having little to do with the events of the Third Age, the dwarves are thrust into the spotlight, and end up fighting for their very survival. The dwarves of Durin's folk, the Longbeards, are the most renowned of the dwarven races, but their impact on the events of Middle-earth has been relatively minimal throughout the First, Second, and Third Age. In fact, they seemingly played no real role in the wars against Morgoth, unlike their Firebeard and Broadbeam cousins in the Blue Mountains. This was perhaps for the best for the Longbeards. The Blue Mountain cities of Nogrod and Belegost were destroyed following the sinking of Beleriand, and most of their folk ended up moving to Khazad-dûm, swelling the population of the mighty dwarven city. These years, the early part of the Second Age, are perhaps the golden age of the Longbeards. They rule a vast kingdom stretching from the Misty Mountains in the west to the Iron Hills in the east, with mountains such as Gundabad and Erebor under their control, as well as the largely untapped mountain range of the Grey Mountains. Allied with the Men of the North and on friendly terms with the elven realms such as Lorinand and Eregion, the Longbeards ended up vastly wealthy and prosperous. However, like many of the other free peoples of Middle-earth, their fortune starts to decline following the rise of Sauron and the War of the Elves in Sauron, in which the Longbeards actively participate in, attacking Sauron's forces in the rear and saving the lives of many elves such as Elrond. As a result, Sauron commands his forces to attack the Longbeards wherever and whenever they can, and as a result, the Longbeards end up losing control of the Grey Mountains and Gundabad at some point in the Second Age. Gundabad is an especially bad loss because it's the site of Durin's awakening, and was seen as a holy site and place of meeting for the seven dwarven clans. The Longbeards then pursue an isolationist policy, which sees many of their Northmen allies destroyed, and likely saw them actually lose places such as Gundabad and the Grey Mountains. Their wealth inside Khazad-dûm increases, but their population begins to dwindle, possibly due to natural decline or maybe the lack of outside communication and trade with the outside world. They do issue forth to aid the last alliance against Sauron, but their number is small in comparison to the other races. Notably, dwarves, possibly from the east, also fight in the War of the Last Alliance, but on the side of Sauron. As the Third Age rolls on, nothing much changes for the Longbeards, till around the year of 1300 of the Third Age. Orcs multiply within the Misty Mountains, and much of the northern part of the range, especially around the region of Angmar, is no longer under the control of the Longbeards. Still, Khazad-dûm is far too powerful to be taken by an external force, as the city is well defended, and its people are still valiant and numerous. However, Khazad-dûm's greatest threat would be from within. In the year of 1980, during the reign of Durin VI, the Longbeards are delving ever deeper for Mithril, the rare, precious metal on which the wealth of Khazad-dûm was founded upon. Deep beneath Caradhras, the mountains the dwarves called Barad-dûr, they stumbled upon a chamber that had been sealed for thousands of years. Lying in sleep was a Balrog, having fled from the fall of Fangorodrim over 5,000 years earlier. This, the dwarves accidentally awakened, and it would become the terror that would haunt their kingdom. That year, Durin VI was killed by the Balrog, but his son, Nain the Thirst, believed the kingdom could still be held. This was in vain, for the following year he too was killed by the Balrog. His son, Thrain the First, realised that the situation was hopeless. The Longbeards would have to abandon Khazad-dûm or be destroyed. The Longbeards fled, and any who remained behind, if there were any, met the same fate as their previous two kings. The kingdom of Khazad-dûm was now Moria, the Black Pit. Thrain I led his folk eastwards, and eventually in the year of 1999, they founded the kingdom of Erebor, the kingdom under the mountain. However, not all of the Longbeards would settle beneath the lonely mountain. Some continued eastwards to their ancient brethren in the Iron Hills, but many made the daring venture north into the Grey Mountains, dangerous and little explored. By Thrain's death in 2190, most of Durin's folk had went north, and Thorin I ruled in Erebor for a mere 30 years before establishing his capital in the Grey Mountains. Here, during the reigns of Thorin I, Gloin, and Oin, the dwarves prospered, once again gaining mastery over the northern mountains. However, the bad luck of the dwarves soon caught up with them. Dragons had lived in the wastes of Forodwaith since the fall of Morgoth, and in that time they had made the Withered Heath, a valley between two arms of the Grey Mountains, as their main breeding ground. Lusting for wealth themselves and hating the dwarves, they soon came into conflict with the Longbeards under the leadership of King Nain II. This war began in 2570, when Nain II was entering old age. He would not live to see the end of the war, dying in 2585. His son, Dain I, inherited a kingdom besieged, and a mere 4 years into his reign, he was slain outside the doors of his halls by a cold drake, along with his second son, Fror. Realizing that they could not best the dragons, most of the Longbeards fled the Grey Mountains under either Fror, eldest son of Dain and spelt with a TH instead of an F, or under Gror, Dain's youngest son. Fror re-established the Kingdom of Erebor, whereas Gror established a separate lordship in the Iron Hills, although still acknowledging Fror as king. Some of Durin's folk remained in the Grey Mountains, although history says nothing else of them, and it is unclear whether they survived to the end of the Third Age. With most of the dwarves gone, the Grey Mountains quickly became the haunt of both orcs and dragons once again. And while we're on the topic of dwarves, I must also mention that the Longbeards weren't the only dwarven clan to come into conflict with dragons. As spoken by Gandalf, 4 of the 7 dwarven rings ended up consumed by dragons, meaning that it is likely that 3 of the other dwarven clans, most likely of the eastern clans, came into conflict with dragons during at some point either in the late Second Age or during the Third Age. Unfortunately for the Longbeards, they were not yet done with dragons. Fror ruled Erebor for 201 years, a legendary reign in which the Longbeards and their neighbours became fabulously wealthy. Yet this wealth attracted unwanted attention, namely from a dragon named Smaug, one of the last great dragons. He descended upon Erebor in 2770, sacking the city and destroying the nearby Northman settlement of Dale. Although Fror and his son and grandson, Thrain II and Thorin II, escaped the destruction, they left behind all of their wealth, becoming poor and destitute. Most of those who escaped fled east to the Iron Hills, but some followed their king and his heirs. They eventually settled in Dunland on the western side of the Misty Mountains. Little is known of their time there, except that their wealth did not grow and they often relied on the charity of the men native to that land. After 20 years, Fror, having become old and seemingly half-crazed, resolved to journey off and find what wealth he could, leaving behind his Ring of Power, and taking only a single servant named Nar. Fror eventually made his way to Moria's East Gate, and despite Nar's pleas, he ventured within. Several days later, his corpse was thrown out of the gate, branded and disfigured by a great orc chieftain known as Azog. Aware of Nar's presence, Azog used him as a messenger, bearing a warning that Fror's fate would await any dwarf who dared enter Moria. As Nar fled down the valley, Fror's body was hacked to pieces and fed to the nearby crows. Upon hearing of the news, Thrain II, now king, was livid, and after 7 days he declared that such an insult could not go unpunished. He sent word to the other dwarven clans, who were happy to assist, as the Longbeards were the most respected of the dwarves, and an insult to Durin's heir was an insult to all dwarves. After 3 years, the forces of all the dwarves had gathered beneath Thrain, many of them having made long journeys from their halls far to the east. Thus, in 2793, commenced the War of the Dwarves and Orcs. Starting in the north, the army of the combined dwarven houses, likely numbering in the tens of thousands, swept down the Misty Mountains. From Gundabad to Gladden, they sacked every orcish stronghold they could find, and did their utmost best to make sure that no orcs survived. Finally, in the year of 2799, most of the mountains had been cleared, and now only one stronghold remained, Moria. There, Azog waited, gathering all of his folk that had so far survived the fury and destruction of the dwarves. At last, the dwarven army came to Azanul Bazaar, known in Elvish as Nanduhirion. This is the valley below the east gate of Moria, and there, on the downward slopes, awaited an army of orcs. Yet Azog, crafty in his ways, hid the true strength of his force until his foes were arrayed against him, and as the dwarven army prepared to advance, he unleashed hidden strength from Moria itself. The dwarves now found themselves at a disadvantage. The orcs outnumbered them and had the higher ground, and it was a dark winter's day without sun to hinder the orcs. Nevertheless, Thrain led his vanguard forward, beginning the Battle of Azanul Bazaar. This assault was unsuccessful, and his forces were thrown into the nearby woods, where both Thrain and Thorin were injured, and Thrain, Thrain's youngest son, and Fundin, his cousin descended from Nain II and father to Balin, were slain. Meanwhile, the main battle swayed back and forth, balanced on the edge of a knife. Finally, an army from the Iron Hills arrived, having been delayed, and turned the tide in favour of the dwarves. These fresh warriors drove a wedge through Azog's forces, fighting their way to the gates of Moria itself. There, Nain, Lord of the Iron Hills, confronted Azog, but whereas Nain was tired, Azog was fresh, and Nain was killed, his neck broken by a blow from Azog's weapon. However, Azog's victory was short-lived, as he noticed that his army was routing, and many of these orcs were desperately fleeing south, where they would eventually find their way to the White Mountains. Azog turned to flee into Moria, only to be run down and beheaded by a dwarf named Dane, the son of the recently slain Nain and the new Lord of the Iron Hills. With Azog's death, the battle was over, as was the war of the dwarves and orcs, but it was a hollow victory to say the least. Nearly half of the dwarven army had been slain, and so great were the losses that the dwarves were forced to burn their dead instead of entombing them in stone. Although Thrain wished to retake Khazad-dûm, he was met with disinterest from the other dwarven clans, who reminded him that Khazad-dûm was not their city. A quote from those who weren't of Durin's folk simply says this: "We fought this war for vengeance, and vengeance we have taken, but it is not sweet. If this is victory, then our hands are too small to hold it." They would begin their long journey home, with neither treasure nor reward, and without many of those who first left their faraway homelands. As for Khazad-dûm, Dane had this to say to Thrain: "You are the father of our folk, and we have bled for you, and will again. But we will not enter Khazad-dûm. You will not enter Khazad-dûm. Only I have looked through the shadow of the gate. Beyond the shadow, it waits for you still, Durin's bane. The world must change, and some other power than ours must come forth before Durin's folk walk again in Moria." So it was that, although the Longbeards had vengeance and the Misty Mountains were made safer, they were still homeless and destitute. Smaug still remained in Erebor, and Durin's bane still remained in Khazad-dûm. Thrain and Thorin returned to Dunland, and shortly afterwards they took what was left of their folk and settled in the Blue Mountains. There, their people slowly grew, but they had neither the wealth nor power they desired. Thrain's heart would always be turned to the east, to their old halls that were taken from them, and soon he would make his move. But that's a story for a future episode. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. As a kid, dwarves were my favourite, and I must have read the Durin's Folk appendices 100 times, so doing this episode brought back a lot of cool memories. Unfortunately, they're no longer my favourite, now I'm Farmer Maggot's #1 fan. Some cool stuff on Balan's Colony next, and I have a new map video on the way, so thanks, cheers, and remember, don't get wealthy, you'll attract dragons.